Hey guys, tonight we slip into the torchlit, echoing halls of medieval castles, where every flicker of candlelight casts dancing shadows on stone walls and tapestries that have probably seen more secrets than your diary app. You trudge over cold flagstones, the scent of roasting meat and beeswax mingling in the air. And you probably won't survive this if you take everything at face value. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your location and local time in the comments, so I can feel like I'm peeking over your shoulder as we wander these historic corridors. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself noticing the little details first. The carved gargoyles staring down from lofty heights, the faint scuff of leather boots across the floor, and, it's almost hidden in plain sight, the figure that turns every scene from static to slightly absurd. This is the jester, the one who dances on the edge of chaos while everyone else is pretending that courtly life is solemn and unshakable. You watch as he shimmies into the great hall, motley glinting under torchlight, bells jingling like mischievous chimes following him everywhere. And you realize the medieval court is part theater, part high-stakes negotiation disguised as daily life. Historians still argue whether the jester's influence was purely entertainment or whether it shaped decisions behind closed doors in ways we can only speculate about. The atmosphere feels almost cinematic as you follow his footsteps. You hear the scrape of his staff on the stone, an absurdly long scepter topped with a carved fool's head, nodding like it's winking at some cosmic joke you're not fully in on yet. There's a tension in the room, a kind of electricity that makes you wonder who might laugh, who might scowl, and who might misinterpret a gesture for sedition. And here's a curious fact. Some jesters weren't just hired for fun, they were often the only people allowed to openly criticize a king or noble. That means your funny little companion here is also a walking, dancing truth grenade. Fringe scholars have even suggested that some jesters acted as early intelligence gatherers, noting everything from courtly infidelities to potential rebellions, while hiding behind slapstick. You might picture him tripping over his own oversized shoes. But in truth, he's a master observer, cataloging the room's secrets as easily as a modern-day barista memorizes coffee orders. You notice the practical side of his presence, too. Every jester carries the smell of the hall with him. Candle smoke, spilled wine, maybe a hint of horse or dog if he's been running errands through the stables. His performance isn't just laughter, it's a multi-sensory experience. You feel the warmth radiating from the hearth, the occasional shiver of a draft sneaking through a slit in the stone, and the almost imperceptible tension that hangs over anyone daring to meet his gaze. You probably wouldn't survive trying to mimic his routine. You'd trip over a cloak, knock over a goblet, or blurt out a poorly timed quip that lands you in trouble. There's a history behind that motley. The patchwork costume, often sewn from scraps of bright fabric, served a dual purpose. On one hand, it made the jester visually distinct, a walking, jingling billboard of chaos. On the other, some suggest it symbolized the fractured social order he was allowed to comment upon. Fringe historians point out that the pointed hat or coxcomb, which looks ridiculous now, may have echoed the crowns or mitres of power in a subtle parody, reminding viewers of the thin line between authority and absurdity. And yet, despite all the laughs, there's danger here. You walk alongside him and feel that the court is not forgiving. One misstep, one poorly aimed joke, and the jester could easily become yesterday's entertainment in the worst possible sense. You probably won't survive trying to mimic his routine. You'd trip over a cloak, knock over a goblet, or blurt out a poorly timed quip that lands you in trouble. And yet, there's an odd charm in watching him navigate the dance of danger with a grin plastered across his face. You can almost hear the historians debating whether jesters were merely tolerated anomalies or actually vital pressure, valves for a kingdom teetering on political tension. You might scoff, thinking it's just a guy in funny clothes. But then he leans close, whispers a joke to the Duke, and you sense that every word carries weight. Every gesture is calculated, even if it looks clumsy. The hall itself responds to him. Tapestries rustle slightly as he passes, chandeliers swing minutely, and you can hear the subtle intake of breath from courtiers pretending not to watch. In the dim candlelight, the shadows stretch long, exaggerating his movements, making him seem larger than life. There as a fringe tale of a jester who could literally distract a jealous noble long enough to save the king from an ambush, a story that probably embellished, but historians still argue whether such incidents were isolated heroics or part of the jester's routine duties. You might imagine him tripping over a dog and accidentally foiling a coup. And honestly, that's probably closer to the truth than you'd think. As you wander alongside him, you notice he's not just performing for the king or queen. He's performing for you, for the room, for the air itself. Every clang of a bell, every exaggerated gesture, every grimace and wink serves multiple audiences simultaneously. The jester's role is not limited to humor. It's an interplay of social navigation, entertainment, and subtle instruction. Think of him as a medieval TikTok star, if TikTok involved actual survival skills and potential beheadings. You might laugh, you might wince, and you might even learn more about power dynamics than any dusty history book could convey. By the time you're settling into the rhythm of this hall, you realize the jester is both everywhere and nowhere. He's a trickster, a spy, a performer, and somehow a confidant to the powerful. And you begin to understand why kings sometimes adored them and feared them in equal measure. You might think it's all slapstick, but look closer, and you'll see he carries the pulse of the court in his chest, the nervous laughter of nobles on his lips, and an uncanny sense for when the room is about to erupt, implode. You trace the path he takes past the long wooden tables, past the flickering shadows, past the tapestries of hunts and battles. You almost expect him to trip over the edge of history itself, but he never does. Instead, he moves like a thread, weaving together the tension, comedy, and subtle truths that define the court. And as you finally let your gaze linger on him, you feel the peculiar mix of amusement and unease that has kept jesters alive for centuries. You're not just watching a performer, you're witnessing a living paradox, dangerously frivolous, yet crucially insightful. You follow the jester closer now, and your eyes are immediately drawn to his costume, a riot of colors stitched together in dizzying patches. Each square seems to hum with its own personality, clashing and clanging like a visual orchestra. You brush your fingers over the heavy fabric in your mind and notice the texture of wool, soft velvet, maybe a stray bit of fur, all chosen not for comfort but for maximum visual impact. Bells dangle from sleeves and hems, jiggling and jingling at every twitch, a sound that both announces and punctuates his presence. You notice, almost instinctively, that the motley's design isn't random. The patterns, colors, and even asymmetry serve a subtle social function, signaling to nobles and servants alike that the wearer is someone permitted by law, by custom, or by fear to bend social rules. Historians still argue whether the jester's costume evolved from purely practical theatrical needs, or whether it intentionally incorporated symbolic mockery of the upper classes. As you watch, a fringe tidbit leaps out. Some sources claim that the bells weren't merely decorative. They were thought to ward off evil spirits. Yes, that's right, Tor, standing next to a man whose entire outfit is a combination of fashion, hazard, and spiritual insurance. You probably wouldn't survive stepping into his shoes, literally, or metaphorically, because part of the skill in wearing this ensemble is moving in such a way that you don't trip on your own exaggeration. That long, pointed hat, coxcomb-like in structure, bounces with every tilt of the head, demanding both balance and timing. You can almost imagine it tapping against a chandelier if he misjudges a gesture, creating an impromptu drum solo that might terrify the dining duchess or amuse the king. You notice how the fabric's colors catch torchlight, producing tiny sparks of visual rhythm in the hall. His outfit isn't just clothing. It's a mobile spectacle that communicates mood, status, and intent. Every patch might have a story: a square ripped from a discarded noble robe, a remnant from a previous performance, or a hand-me-down gifted to signify trust, mockery, or simple amusement. Fringe historians suggest that certain patterns might even act as coded messages, understood only by those who regularly attend court-a-secret language woven in cloth. You feel a slight shiver realizing that every wink, every exaggerated gesture, every flutter of colored fabric is a form of communication you can only partly decipher. The bells provide constant auditory punctuation. You imagine trying to sneak down the corridor unnoticed in these shoes impossible. Yet that jingling isn't mere accident. It serves as an early warning system for both allies and potential threats. Courtiers begin to predict where he will land, laugh, or make mischief, adjusting their reactions accordingly. And yes, there's skill in moving so flamboyantly that you remain unpredictable. You probably wouldn't survive trying to imitate it, because even one wrong bell chime might turn the room's amusement into irritation, or worse, suspicion. You notice the hat again, exaggeratedly pointed and curving, like some surreal cartoon. Fringe tales describe jesters whose hats were stuffed with straw or even bells, making them literal noisemakers, amplifying every motion. Some jesters reportedly had hats designed to resemble a bishop's mitre, poking sly fun at church authorities, a subtle jab hidden within the comical absurdity. Historians still argue whether this sort of visual parody was intentional political commentary or simply evolved from playful theatrical convention. You realize your mind is processing a million tiny signals at once: texture, sound, color, movement, all coalescing into a carefully curated performance that requires both skill and intuition. You notice the gloves, oddly long and often tipped with bells themselves. These aren't just for show. They highlight gestures, exaggerate hand motions, and sometimes conceal tiny props a hidden rattle, a trick coin, or even a sharpened edge for stage swordplay. You probably wouldn't survive trying to improvise with these tools without at least a year of practice, because the balance of comedy and threat is delicate. Even the simplest flip of a glove could be misread, transforming laughter into panic. As you continue your silent observation, the shoes demand attention. Pointed, curled, and almost mischievously defiant of balance, they jolt the jester's silhouette into the realm of the absurd. Fringe historians claim that certain curled toes were meant to parody noble fashion trends, exaggerating the court's own obsession with vanity. You imagine him stepping lightly across the stone floor, bells announcing his passage, toes twitching in visual mockery. There's an unspoken language here. Each motion communicates intent, mood, and social commentary, a choreography encoded in leather and fabric. Historians still argue whether nobles actively understood these signals or if the jester was performing in a semi-private code known only to a select few. You notice the tactile contrast between the motley and the belt, a wide leather band carrying pouches and small instruments. Fringe accounts suggest that some belts were reinforced with metal rings to make an audible clang when the jester made a dramatic spin, subtle sound effects, adding to the theater of movement. You realize you're witnessing a living combination of costume design, performance art, and tactical signaling. You probably wouldn't survive trying to move this way yourself. Your limbs too clumsy to mimic the grace and timing required. Your attention too easily distracted by curiosity. You watch him bend low in a playful bow toward a duke, and the bells jingle in perfect sync with his exaggerated hand gesture. The sequence is effortless, precise, and mesmerizing. You notice a fringe detail: some jesters reportedly trained in acrobatics or swordplay. Their motley hiding a dual function as both costume and minor armor, allowing them to perform dangerous tricks without serious injury. Historians still argue whether the costume's protective features were genuine or merely clever rumors meant to amplify the jester's mystique. You feel a thrill recognizing the blend of practical skill and theatrical deception that surrounds him. Nothing is wasted, everything is amplified. You begin to understand why the motley is so critical. It is the jester's armor, identity, and billboard all at once. You imagine stepping into it too heavy, too bright, too noisy, and you shiver at how you would instantly betray yourself as an amateur. Even the fringe details, the embroidered patches, the jingling bells, the curled toes, all serve a purpose. The costume is a mobile narrative, telling everyone in the room who he is, what he might do, and how far he can push the boundaries before someone cries foul. As you drift behind him toward the main hall, you notice how the light plays across the fabric. Reds and yellows clash, blues and greens deepen, each patch catching torchlight in a slightly different way, a visual jazz riff on the monotony of noble clothing. You recognize that this performance extends beyond humor. It is a sensory orchestration designed to manipulate attention, emotion, and perception. Fringe historians even suggest that the visual chaos of the motley allowed the jester to slip into moments of subtle influence, distracting nobles just long enough to plant an idea, observe a reaction, or test boundaries. And yet, despite the bells, the colors, and the exaggerated gestures, there's a fluidity to his motion. He moves like someone entirely comfortable in chaos, translating absurdity into authority. You probably wouldn't survive copying him. Your hands too stiff, your eyes too literal, your brain untrained in the subtle interplay of sight, sound, and social cunning. You feel the jester's costume is not just an outfit, it's a carefully calibrated instrument of survival, expression, and persuasion, a wearable manifestation of the paradox that defines him. Ridiculous yet dangerous, whimsical yet profoundly perceptive. You edge closer now, and the tension of the hall becomes palpable. The jester is no longer merely a visual spectacle. He is a verbal tightrope walker, balancing humor, observation, and danger on a single, invisible line. You notice the way nobles shift in their seats, trying to anticipate what he will do or say next. You probably won't survive trying to insert yourself into this dance uninvited, because even a minor misstep could turn amusement into mortal offense. Historians still argue whether Jester's license to mock was absolute or conditional, dependent entirely on a monarch's temperament that could swing from laughter to lethal irritation in a heartbeat. You watch him approach the king, bowing with an exaggerated tilt that seems absurd until you notice the micro-gestures, the tilt of his eyes, the twitch of his lips that signal deference while hinting at subtle subversion. The king leans back, amused yet wary, aware that this fool can deliver truths in the guise of jokes that no advisor dares voice openly. Fringe accounts suggest that some jesters were trusted more than counselors, carrying messages and opinions that could sway decisions, yet always shielded by the humor that cloaked their insight. You feel a shiver recognizing the power of levity as protection, a paradox of medieval court life. You probably wouldn't survive attempting such verbal acrobatics. One misplaced word, one poorly timed quip, and the room could shift from laughter to suspicion. The jester's voice dances between tones, flipping from absurdity to insight in a heartbeat. You hear him recount a story of a clumsy noble, the tale clearly exaggerated. Yet you sense the underlying critique, that arrogance can blind those in power. Historians still argue whether these tales were spontaneous improvisations or carefully rehearsed commentaries that had been honed over months of observation. Either way, you recognize that every sentence carries weight, hidden beneath layers of humor. You notice the jester's gestures, each punctuated by the twitching bells on his sleeves. Fringe reports claim some jesters memorized entire court routines and personalities, deploying tailored jokes that could provoke laughter, reflection, or embarrassment, depending on audience reaction. You probably wouldn't survive trying to improvise at this level. Your brain would freeze, your timing would falter, and the subtle social cues would escape you. Yet the jester navigates this terrain as if it were a stage in his very bones, moving seamlessly between absurdity and truth. You realize he is not just mocking the king, but also the entire hierarchy of court. A flick of the hand, a playful stumble, and suddenly the pomp and grandeur of nobility feels fragile, almost silly. Fringe historians even suggest that some jesters employed cryptic humor to test political tensions, observing how nobles reacted to sly insinuations or exaggerated portrayals of incompetence. You probably wouldn't survive analyzing the full implications of these interactions in real time. The skill lies not just in performing, but in reading reactions with acute attention. Historians still argue whether jesters consciously shaped court politics or merely reflected the tensions they witnessed. You notice the way the jester adjusts his tone when speaking to the queen, softer, more melodious, almost conspiratorial. You probably want to survive imagining the pressure of these dual audiences. A king who might laugh or frown, and a queen who might subtly steer conversation in directions the jester must anticipate. He juggles multiple layers of communication at once: literal humor, hidden truth, and social navigation, all while maintaining the facade of ridiculousness. Fringe anecdotes even suggest that some jesters could diffuse potential violence simply by inserting the right joke at the right time. A skill that sounds absurd, but apparently saved lives more than once. The king chuckles at a particularly pointed jest, and you notice a ripple across the courtiers, a mixture of relief, amusement, and cautious admiration. You probably wouldn't survive maintaining such control over reactions. Your face would betray your intent, your words stumble, and your timing would collapse. Yet the jester's art lies precisely in this mastery: reading subtle cues, projecting confidence, and bending humor into a shield that allows him to speak truths others dare not. Historians still argue whether the jester's role was primarily entertainment or whether he functioned as an early form of political advisor, masked in the guise of comedy. You observe the sly glances exchanged among the nobles as the jester twists his story. Fringe stories tell of a jester who could provoke a jealous duke into public embarrassment, while simultaneously winning the king's favor, all in a single well-timed pun. You probably wouldn't survive the mental gymnastics required to perform such feats without months of study, observation, and courage, because it involves the simultaneous management of egos, expectations, and perilous social currents. The room is a live chessboard, and every joke is a move that might tip the balance of influence. You notice the subtle props he carries, tucked beneath his motley: a mirror for reflection jokes, a small dagger for theatrical effect, and tiny bells that act as punctuation marks for his narrative. Fringe historians note that these props sometimes carried hidden meanings: a mirror reflecting a courtier's vanity, a dagger suggesting the sharpness of wit over brute force. You probably wouldn't survive interpreting them in real time, let alone wielding them in performance. Yet to the jester, these objects are extensions of himself, tools to communicate, amuse, and, when necessary, caution. As you watch the interplay of words and gestures, you recognize the delicate balance he maintains. A poorly chosen insult could end his career, or worse. Yet, every joke is an experiment, a probe into the fragility of power. Fringe tales claim that some jesters even influenced treaties and alliances by planting provocative humor that highlighted weaknesses or absurdities in policy. Historians still argue whether these claims are overblown or reflect a kernel of truth about the jester's subtle authority. You probably wouldn't survive such responsibility. You'd flinch at the wrong laugh or misread a noble's expression, but he thrives in this precarious space, turning performance into influence. You notice the rhythm of his speech, the pauses that allow laughter to swell, the inflection that signals a hidden critique. Fringe records describe a jester who used puns to relay coded messages, allowing him to influence decisions without ever appearing overtly political. Historians still argue whether these techniques were standard practice or rare exceptions. You probably wouldn't survive trying to deploy such layered humor without extensive training, keen observation, and nerves of steel. Yet here he is, walking the fine line between amusement and admonition, delivering subtle truths wrapped in the comforting guise of folly. Finally, you see the jester bow deeply, his bells jingling in a final flourish, as the king laughs heartily and the courtiers exhale in relief. You feel the tension in the room dissipate slightly, yet you remain aware that this dance between ridicule and insight continues behind every smile. Fringe anecdotes suggest that jesters sometimes used humor to quietly settle disputes or steer conversations away from dangerous topics, a role that is both invisible and indispensable. Historians still argue whether their influence was intentional or incidental. You probably wouldn't survive stepping into this arena untrained. Every glance, every gesture, every word is calibrated to maintain both survival and authority. In this hall of painted walls, flickering torches, and wary courtiers, you understand the jester's paradox. Outwardly foolish, yet inwardly masterful. Dangerously close to insult, yet safely shielded by laughter. You see the delicate skill required to mock kings without losing one's head, to speak truths hidden beneath absurdity, and to navigate social currents that could turn deadly in an instant. You feel the jester is more than entertainment. He is a social instrument, a living paradox whose survival depends on wit, timing, and an uncanny grasp of human psychology. And as you settle into the rhythm of this performance, you begin to sense that this is a world where humor is not just laughter, it is survival, insight, and quiet influence, all rolled into one. You linger a moment, still marveling at the precarious verbal tightrope the jester walks, and then your attention shifts to his hands. They're no longer idle. Juggling knives, balls, or flaming torches has become part of the spectacle. You probably won't survive attempting such feats. Your coordination would collapse under pressure, but watching him, you can feel the hypnotic rhythm of practice and precision. Historians still argue whether juggling was merely entertainment or if it subtly conveyed lessons about balance, danger, and skill to the court. You notice the smooth arc of a tossing knife, catching torchlight in a glint that sends a shiver down your spine. Fringe anecdotes claim that some jesters doubled as skilled fighters, using their props not only for comedy, but also as hidden tools for defense or mischief. You might imagine the juggler accidentally cutting through a noble's sleeve. But the reality is that the jester trains extensively, perfecting every motion to appear whimsical while remaining precise. You probably wouldn't survive a single minute in his shoes without a near disaster. The juggling extends beyond knives and torches. You watch him toss brightly colored balls into the air, catching them with the same hands that produce subtle sleight of hand tricks. Fringe historians suggest that these tricks may have carried symbolic meaning, representing the juggling of alliances, rumors, and royal favor, all performed under the watchful eyes of the court. You can almost see the invisible lines connecting each thrown object to the political and social dance occurring around him. Historians still argue whether these metaphors were intentional or if later chroniclers retroactively assigned meaning. He transitions seamlessly to storytelling, weaving riddles and puns into the air like ribbons. You probably won't survive trying to match his linguistic dexterity. Every joke, every riddle, every playful rhyme is calibrated to elicit laughter while skating along the edge of critique. Fringe records tell of jesters who could embed subtle commentary on taxation, military strategy, or court scandals into seemingly trivial anecdotes. You realize that listening isn't passive. You are decoding layered messages, some for amusement, others for insight. You notice the timing of his pauses. He allows laughter to bloom, then cuts it short with a sudden gesture or quip that shifts attention. Fringe scholars point out that some jesters intentionally use timing to manipulate the energy in the room, calming tensions, highlighting rivalries, or testing allegiances. Historians still argue whether such timing was instinctual or taught. You probably wouldn't survive even attempting this manipulation without intense study and observation of human behavior. A ball escapes his hand, bouncing toward a noble's foot. You feel the tension spike. The noble recoils, expecting chaos. Yet the jester improvises, catching the ball mid-bounce with a flourish that turns near disaster into applause. Fringe stories suggest that such improvisation was a daily exercise, preparing jesters to navigate unpredictable social landscapes. You probably wouldn't survive the constant pressure to turn mistakes into entertainment without nerves of steel and lightning reflexes. Then comes a juggling sequence with flaming torches. You feel the heat before you see it, flickering shadows dancing along the stone walls. You probably won't survive such a stunt without singeing eyebrows or worse, but he executes it flawlessly, weaving danger and comedy together in a way that feels effortless. Historians still argue whether fire tricks were standard in every court or reserved for particularly flamboyant jesters. Fringe tales claim that some fools used small pyrotechnics to emphasize moral lessons or highlight the folly of greed and vanity. As he moves between juggling, you notice his subtle use of body language. He leans, spins, and tilts in ways that exaggerate or parody the noble's own movements, creating a mirrored dance that is both hilarious and insightful. Fringe accounts suggest these gestures functioned as coded critiques of individual courtiers, visible only to those attuned to the jester's signals. You probably wouldn't survive decoding these layers of meaning without years of experience. Historians still argue whether these critiques were ever consciously acknowledged or if they simply added texture to the performance. You see him integrate small props into the act. A wooden spoon transformed into a scepter. A glove pulled off to mimic an offended noble. A tiny bag of flour tossed into the air for comic effect. You probably won't survive improvising at this level. Your props would either flop or hit the wrong person. Fringe historians suggest that props were extensions of personality, each carefully chosen for its comedic, symbolic, or narrative potential. Historians still argue whether the props carried messages beyond the immediate laughter, subtle social commentary that only the sharpest observers could decode. You notice how the jester's eyes dart constantly, scanning the room as he performs. He registers laughter, scowls, whispers, and nervous glances, calibrating his act moment by moment. Fringe tales suggest that some jesters memorize the personalities of entire courts, tracking reactions to predict future events or guide subtle influence. You probably wouldn't survive maintaining such acute awareness while juggling knives, riddles, and social cues. Historians still argue whether this observational skill was formally taught or purely learned through experience. The combination of juggling, riddles, and acrobatics creates a rhythm that the hall seems to pulse with. You feel almost hypnotized by the interplay of sound, motion, and laughter. Fringe accounts suggest that jesters sometimes used rhythmic elements to distract or redirect attention during tense discussions, a kind of social sleight of hand. You probably wouldn't survive orchestrating such multidimensional performance without losing your own composure. Historians still argue whether these techniques were widespread or confined to particularly gifted individuals. He finishes a sequence by juggling 3 objects with one hand, spinning in a flourish and landing perfectly on his feet. The courtiers erupt in applause, relief, and laughter, a collective exhalation that punctuates the tension he has been managing throughout. You probably wouldn't survive the combination of precision, charisma, and danger required to achieve such a feat. Fringe historians claim that some jesters intentionally escalated risks to test loyalty, courage, or attentiveness, creating high-stakes entertainment that doubled as social experiment. Historians still argue whether these performances were consciously manipulative or simply part of the art form. You notice that even the smallest details, the flick of a wrist, the tilt of a head, the jingle of a bell contribute to the performance's impact. Each motion is layered with humor, danger, and social insight. Fringe anecdotes suggest that jesters sometimes incorporated audience reactions into their act, adapting routines spontaneously to ensure maximum effect. You probably wouldn't survive this improvisational precision without years of training, observation, and instinctive timing. Historians still argue whether this adaptability was innate talent or learned skill, though either way, the mastery is undeniable. Finally, as the juggling slows and the hall settles, you notice the effect of his act on the room. Courtiers relax, conversations restart, and tension dissipates, all orchestrated by a man in motley who seems entirely absurd, yet utterly essential. Fringe accounts suggest that this is exactly the point. The jester manages both entertainment and social equilibrium, turning chaos into structure with humor as the primary tool. You probably wouldn't survive observing or participating without being drawn into the delicate balance of danger, laughter, and influence. Historians still argue whether these acts were formally recognized as instruments of diplomacy or merely charming distractions, but you sense that their impact is undeniable. By the time he steps back, breathless but smiling, you realize that juggling is more than skillet is a metaphor for the jester's role. He balances danger and delight, critique and compliment, chaos and control. You probably wouldn't survive replicating this delicate dance, but watching him, you understand that the jester is a master of multitasking in a world where a single misstep could be fatal. He has turned movement, sound, and wit into a living language, speaking volumes without ever leaving the mask of folly. And as you observe, the hall itself seems to sigh in relief, settling into a rhythm that mirrors the balance only he can maintain. You lean back against the cold stone wall and notice how, amidst the bells, juggling, and raucous laughter, the jester sometimes pauses to whisper truths no one else dares voice. It's subtle, almost imperceptible, but you can feel the undercurrent of meaning beneath each joke. You probably won't survive attempting this yourself because it requires a mix of timing, insight, and courage few can manage. Historians still argue whether jesters wielded real political influence or whether their clever commentary was simply tolerated amusement. You notice the way he bends toward a young page, telling a story about a clumsy noble who tried to impress the queen. The narrative is exaggerated, hilarious, and seemingly harmless. Yet in the subtle tilts of his head, the cadence of his words, you recognize a pointed critique. Fringe scholars suggest that jesters often used humor to highlight injustices or reveal social absurdities that might otherwise remain invisible. You probably wouldn't survive interpreting all these cues in real time. The layers of meaning are delicate and intricate. He moves through the hall, slipping among nobles with uncanny fluidity, delivering jokes and riddles that elicit laughter and occasional nervous shifts in posture. Fringe tales even claim that some jesters memorized gossip, secrets, and rumors, then cleverly incorporated them into performances so that the truths reached the king without anyone realizing it. You probably wouldn't survive managing such a double life using the court while simultaneously acting as a social spy. Historians still argue whether these tactics were widespread or confined to particularly clever individuals. You watch him pause to mimic a pompous lord, exaggerating posture, voice, and facial expressions. The courtiers laugh, the lord flushes, and the jester has delivered a critique wrapped in absurdity. Fringe accounts suggest this technique allowed jesters to test boundaries. Could a noble accept ridicule without retribution? You probably wouldn't survive navigating such risk. You'd either offend or fail to amuse. A dangerous combination in this delicate ecosystem. You notice how the jester sometimes tells riddles that seem nonsensical at first, but carry layers of social commentary. You probably won't survive attempting such wordplay under pressure. It's a combination of verbal agility, timing, and keen observation of reactions. Fringe historians argue that these riddles could subtly guide policy discussions or highlight flaws in courtly behavior. Historians still debate whether these messages were intended as guidance or merely clever entertainment. Though in either case, the effect is undeniable. The jester occasionally leans close to a king or queen, whispering an aside between jokes. You feel the electricity of tension in those moments. Laughter serves as camouflage for messages that could influence decisions. Fringe accounts suggest that jesters sometimes acted as unofficial counselors, their humor allowing them to voice unpopular truths that advisors could not. You probably wouldn't survive this dual role, where each word must be both innocuous and significant. Historians still argue whether these interventions materially shaped political outcomes or simply provided amusement. You notice small, absurd props. He uses a miniature crown, a feathered fan, a squeaky bladder-stick, and how he manipulates them to emphasize points about vanity, greed, or folly. Fringe tales claim that jesters embedded satire in every movement, making their props both comedic and instructive. You probably wouldn't survive translating these visual cues into actual insight. It's a subtle language, understood by those attuned to the court's rhythms. Historians still argue whether the symbolic content was intentional or constructed by later chroniclers seeking deeper meaning. He shifts to mimic a particularly boastful knight, recounting his own heroics in over-the-top pantomime. You probably wouldn't survive understanding the layers of critique. The exaggerated actions reflect not just the knight's flaws, but broader lessons on pride and performance. Fringe historians suggest jesters often used these parodies as cautionary tales, testing whether courtiers could laugh at themselves and, by extension, manage ego and decorum. Historians still debate whether these moments had practical social influence or were simply moments of entertainment. You notice the audience's reactions. Subtle shifts in posture, quick glances, quiet exhalations. Each laugh, snicker, or swallowed gasp is a signal, a small acknowledgement of truth disguised as folly. Fringe sources report jesters keeping mental maps of these responses, adjusting performances to reinforce alliances, highlight tensions, or ease conflicts. You probably wouldn't survive tracking these interactions in real time. The level of social acuity is extraordinary. Historians still argue whether this attentiveness was conscious manipulation or simply instinctive observation honed over years. The jester concludes this sequence by weaving a story involving a minor dispute over taxes, dressed in absurd characters and exaggerated tones. The nobles laugh heartily. Yet beneath the comedy, the point is clear. Folly can expose injustice, and humor can serve as a vehicle for uncomfortable truths. Fringe tales suggest that some jesters' critiques were so pointed that they influenced royal edicts or inspired minor reforms. You probably wouldn't survive trying to blend comedy and insight so seamlessly. Even the smallest error could turn amusement into offense. Historians still debate the extent of jesterly influence, but there's little doubt that their observations left an imprint on the social and political fabric of the court. You notice how his voice changes subtly depending on the target of his critique. Softer, gentler tones for sensitive subjects. Sharper, more exaggerated inflections for the pompous or vain. You probably wouldn't survive such vocal gymnastics without careful rehearsal and keen awareness of human psychology. Fringe accounts suggest that jesters could adjust their approach mid-performance, reading micro-expressions and subtle cues to determine how far a joke could go. Historians still argue whether this skill was innate or trained, though either way, it highlights the jester's role as both entertainer and social barometer. You observe how he layers commentary through story, gesture, and prop, creating a performance that feels chaotic but is carefully orchestrated. You probably wouldn't survive this level of multitasking. Balancing humor, insight, and safety is a skill few can master. Fringe scholars note that some jesters were capable of guiding public opinion subtly, shaping courtly behavior while appearing entirely frivolous. Historians still debate whether these effects were deliberate or incidental, but the sophistication is clear. Finally, you notice the calm that follows his act. Courtiers relax, laughter subsides, and the room settles, subtly reshaped by his performance. You probably wouldn't survive the intricate dance of observation, improvisation, and critique that allows the jester to walk this line daily. Fringe accounts claim that some jesters were credited with averting crises. using humor to de-escalate tensions or illuminate issues without confrontation. Historians still argue whether these interventions were extraordinary or typical. Yet the evidence suggests that jesters often wielded a quiet, pervasive influence on the court's social equilibrium. You realize that the jester's art is not just about laughter. It is about revealing hidden truths, manipulating perception, and maintaining balance in a volatile social environment. Every joke, riddle, and gesture serves multiple purposes: entertaining, instructing, and subtly steering the complex machinery of power. You probably wouldn't survive attempting this without years of training, extraordinary insight, and nerves of steel. And yet, watching him, you sense that this is the heart of the jester's role. Using folly as a shield, humor as a bridge, and laughter as a weapon of subtle truth. You step back for a moment, catching your breath, and notice how the jester's companions, or what might charitably be called companions, add another layer of chaos to his performance. You probably won't survive handling a monkey piglet or bladder-stick parade without disaster ensuing. Yet he does it with the grace of someone born into this madness. Fringe accounts claim that these animals were more than props. They acted as extensions of the jester's wit, embodying human folly in exaggerated form. Historians still argue whether the animals were trained deliberately for humor or merely tolerated mischief makers. You watch a monkey scamper across the hall, clutching a tiny replica of the jester's motley hat, while the jester twirls a ball in one hand and jingles bells with the other. You probably wouldn't survive such a scene without being utterly overwhelmed. Fringe anecdotes suggest that monkeys were chosen for their mimicry, highlighting the absurdity of human behavior, while pigs sometimes served as tactile comic relief, rooting in ways that startled courtiers and provoked laughter. You can almost hear a courtier whisper, "Is that a pig making a better bow than I just did?" The jester manipulates these props and animals with a combination of precision and improvisation. A tiny bladder-stick squeaks loudly as he waves it toward a lord, eliciting both laughter and mild embarrassment. Fringe sources report that some jesters used such objects to punctuate verbal jokes, create rhythm and performance, or even distract attention at opportune moments. You probably wouldn't survive attempting to coordinate multiple animals, props, and gestures while reading the room in real time. Historians still argue whether the spectacle of animals and absurd items functioned purely as entertainment or carried subtle moral commentary. You notice the jester's timing, particularly with the animals. A monkey climbs a noble's leg, and before panic can set in, he intervenes with exaggerated panic of his own, turning potential chaos into comic gold. Fringe tales suggest that some jesters train their animals to execute precise comedic beats, reinforcing both humor and social commentary. You probably wouldn't survive managing the unpredictability of live animals, each with its own personality and agenda. Historians still argue whether these antics were controlled performances or delightfully chaotic improvisations. You observe the jester using props to interact with courtiers subtly. A tiny crown is dropped onto a noble's head at just the right moment, a feather duster waved in rhythm with his monologue, and a squeaky bladder-stick punctuating his punchlines. Fringe historians suggest these items sometimes conveyed coded messages about courtly behavior or moral failings. You probably wouldn't survive interpreting these layered cues while maintaining the performance. Historians still argue whether these symbolic gestures were widely understood or appreciated only by a select few. As the jester moves, you notice his uncanny ability to read reactions. A piglet waddles across the floor, and he instantly adapts, shifting the joke's focus, changing tone, and modifying gestures. Fringe accounts note that such adaptability allowed jesters to maintain authority and humor even in unpredictable circumstances. You probably wouldn't survive this rapid improvisation, as it demands continuous observation, lightning reflexes, and a sense for social nuance. Historians still argue whether these skills were innate or honed through rigorous apprenticeship. You notice that the jester sometimes positions animals and props to mock hierarchy subtly. A monkey might mimic a haughty duke's posture, or a piglet may root near the foot of a fuming noble. Fringe tales claim that these visual cues served as indirect criticism, making absurdity visible and providing safe outlets for courtly tensions. You probably wouldn't survive understanding the complex interplay of symbolism, humor, and timing required to pull this off. Historians still debate whether these performances influenced behavior or simply amused onlookers. You observe the jester interacting with children in the court, a group often forgotten in historical accounts. Fringe stories suggest that jesters used animals and absurd props to engage young minds, teaching social norms through humor while subtly imparting lessons about caution, respect, and observation. You probably wouldn't survive performing for a mixed audience of nobles, children, and unpredictable animals without chaos erupting. Historians still argue whether this educational aspect was deliberate or incidental. The interplay between jester and animals highlights a delicate choreography. You notice that each step, toss, and squeak is timed to maximize both laughter and insight. Fringe accounts report that some jesters memorized behavioral tendencies of both animals and courtiers, blending physical comedy with social critique. You probably wouldn't survive coordinating such an ensemble, each element requiring attention, timing, and adaptation. Historians still argue whether these techniques were innovative improvisation or codified performance traditions, passed down through generations. You watch a finale where the jester orchestrates a parade of props and animals, culminating in a flourish of bells, a toss of the monkey, a squeak from the bladder-stick, and an exaggerated bow. The hall erupts in laughter, relief, and admiration. Fringe historians claim that these elaborate sequences sometimes served dual purposes: entertainment and subtle reinforcement of social hierarchy, with humor keeping nobles mindful of their conduct. You probably wouldn't survive attempting such intricate staging, balancing comedy, danger, and social insights simultaneously. Historians still argue whether these elaborate performances were typical or reserved for exceptional jesters. You notice the effect on the room. Tension dissipates, laughter spreads, and previously tense nobles find a moment of human levity. Fringe accounts suggest that this was precisely the jester's intent: to create temporary equilibrium, a social reset disguised as amusement. You probably wouldn't survive the combination of observation, improvisation, and timing required to orchestrate such influence. Historians still debate whether these interventions had lasting impact or were ephemeral. Yet their immediate effect is undeniable. As the animals scurry back to their designated corners and the props are gathered, you feel a profound sense of coordination behind the apparent chaos. The jester's role extends beyond simple amusement. He is a master of social orchestration, using movement, sound, and playful absurdity to influence mood, behavior, and even perception. You probably wouldn't survive stepping into this arena without intense training, acute observational skills, and nerves of steel. Fringe tales claim some jesters could subtly resolve disputes through the careful deployment of props and animals alone. Historians still argue whether this was intentional or merely a happy accident of performance. Yet, the sophistication is clear. Finally, you watch the jester bow, bells jingling, animals retreating, and the hall settling into a quiet afterglow. You probably wouldn't survive replicating this delicate balance of chaos, humor, and influence. Fringe accounts suggest that this ability to calm and redirect courtly tension was as valuable as any sword or counsel. Historians still argue whether the jester's role in courtly diplomacy was formalized or informal. But the evidence suggests that in this intricate theater of power, the fool's skill at orchestrating attention, laughter, and subtle critique was indispensable. You realize that the jester's parade of animals and props is not merely comic relief. It is a language, a system of influence, and a survival strategy. Every squeak, scamper, and toss communicates layers of meaning to those perceptive enough to understand. You probably wouldn't survive navigating this web of absurdity and subtle instruction without becoming a student of both comedy and courtly politics. And as you watch him settle the hall into calm, you understand. The absurd companions, the ridiculous props, and the careful choreography are not frivolities. They are essential tools in the jester's art of shaping perception, maintaining equilibrium, and guiding the hearts and minds of the powerful. You sit quietly now, catching your breath, as the hall begins to settle from the whirlwind of juggling, animals, and props. Yet the jester's influence lingers like a faint echo, subtle but unmistakable. You probably won't survive understanding the full extent of his social navigation. Because it requires more than observation, it demands empathy, calculation, and courage under constant scrutiny. Historians still argue whether jesters were primarily entertainers, political commentators, or early psychologists disguised in motley. You notice how he shifts his attention to the dining tables, weaving through nobles, sipping wine, or nibbling on roasted meats. Fringe accounts claim that jesters often used mealtime to deliver pointed commentary, inserting jokes about greed, gluttony, or vanity into seemingly innocuous observations. You probably wouldn't survive such multitasking, balancing humor. Danger and the subtle nudges of social critique require skill that borders on the uncanny. The way he pauses to let laughter bloom before cutting it off with a sly remark demonstrates timing that feels almost instinctual. You observe a noble attempting to boast about military exploits. The jester interrupts with the story of an overconfident goose that charged a wolf and lost spectacularly, eliciting laughter while hinting at the folly of arrogance. Fringe historians suggest that jesters use allegories like this to convey critiques without triggering direct confrontation. You probably wouldn't survive trying to encode criticism and humor so seamlessly your message would either be lost or provoke unintended offense. Historians still argue whether this method genuinely shaped noble behavior or simply amused audiences, while providing temporary relief from social tension. You watch him engage in a brief, seemingly frivolous dance across the floor, bells jingling in erratic rhythm. Yet you notice subtle microgestures, a glance toward a scowling lord, a tilt of the head acknowledging the queen, a shift in stance to mirror a nervous page. Fringe accounts suggest that these subtle gestures were deliberate, providing feedback and probing reactions. You probably wouldn't survive performing such nuanced communication under pressure. Even minor miscalculations could derail social equilibrium. Historians still argue whether these microgestures were universally understood or accessible only to the most observant court members. He pauses, squatting to mimic a lowly servant, then straightens with exaggerated dignity. Mimicking the king's posture, you probably won't survive seeing the layers unfold. His act is not only comic, but also deeply reflective of social hierarchies. Fringe tales describe jesters exaggerating status differences to highlight the absurdity of rigid rank structures. Historians still debate whether such acts encouraged nobles to self-reflect or simply provided harmless entertainment. Either way, the effect is tangible. The court relaxes, tension diffuses, and the absurdity of human behavior becomes a shared experience. You notice a series of clever wordplays now, puns that appear frivolous but contain subtle critiques. One joke about a clumsy knight reveals not only his vanity, but also the social consequences of arrogance. Fringe accounts suggest that jesters memorized complex catalogs of individual personalities and weaknesses to tailor humor effectively. You probably wouldn't survive attempting this without years of observation and a sharp memory. Historians still argue whether these jokes directly influenced behavior or functioned as harmless amusement that subtly reinforced social norms. You watch him produce a small, mirrored device, holding it up to reflect a noble's expression exaggeratedly back at him. Laughter erupts as vanity and self-consciousness collide. Fringe tales suggest these mirrors were tools of indirect critique, allowing jesters to highlight flaws without direct accusation. You probably wouldn't survive executing such visual commentary with timing, grace, and social awareness intact. Historians still debate whether the mirrors served purely comedic purposes or also functioned as instruments of social calibration, subtly steering courtiers' behavior. The jester then produces a small, squeaky animal, a piglet, in a tiny harness and navigates it through a series of exaggerated movements. Courtiers laugh, yet beneath the humor. The act carries multiple layers: amusement, tension, relief, and social instruction. Fringe historians suggest that such performances doubled as social experiments, subtly observing reactions to folly, absurdity, and risk. You probably wouldn't survive balancing humor, narrative, and observational research in real time. Historians still argue whether jesters intentionally conducted these social experiments, or whether observers later read meaning into spontaneous antics. You notice the subtle ways he manipulates attention. A dangling bell, a sudden bow, a whispered aside, all guide gaze, thought, and laughter strategically. Fringe tales describe jesters as architects of focus, directing where attention falls and, by extension, which social dynamics are highlighted or masked. You probably wouldn't survive this level of orchestration without acute situational awareness and improvisational skill. Historians still debate whether this ability to direct attention was universally understood or relied on audience sophistication. He pauses near a king, delivering a riddle with double meaning. The court laughs at the surface joke, but you sense deeper commentary: a warning, a reflection, a subtle nudge. Fringe accounts suggest some riddles were intentionally ambiguous, providing plausible deniability while communicating critique. You probably wouldn't survive decoding or delivering such layered messages simultaneously. Historians still argue whether these riddles genuinely influenced decisions or simply entertained, while allowing the jester to appear foolish, yet clever. The jester then moves among the pages, providing physical commedia stumble, a mock scold, a playful tap that relieves tension among young courtiers, while illustrating subtle lessons about hierarchy, obedience, and observation. Fringe historians argue that these interactions helped instill social norms without resorting to harsh correction. You probably wouldn't survive balancing lessons, laughter, and the unpredictability of youthful attention. Historians still debate whether these techniques were formalized training tools or incidental, ad hoc teaching moments. Finally, you notice how the jester steps back, surveying the room like a conductor after a symphony. Laughter lingers, tension dissolves, and social order has been subtly reinforced or recalibrated. Fringe accounts suggest that such orchestration of mood and attention was central to a jester's skill set. You probably wouldn't survive this blend of humor, insight, and risk without extensive experience. Historians still argue whether the impact of a jester's performance was enduring or fleeting. Yet the immediate effect on mood and social dynamics is unmistakable. You realize that beyond jokes, gestures, and props, the jester functions as an emotional compass. You probably wouldn't survive observing without recognizing how every micro-action guides the court, shifts attention, and balances power. His art lies in harmonizing absurdity with authority, critique with entertainment, and levity with subtle influence. Fringe accounts suggest that the jester's ability to combine humor, observation, and subtle guidance may have been one of the most sophisticated instruments of social navigation in the medieval court. Historians still argue whether this skill was exceptional or widespread. But watching him now, the jester's mastery of perception, manipulation, and comedy is undeniable. You drift further into the hall, noticing how the jester's presence changes the rhythm of the room itself. Every laugh, every jingle, every flick of a hand seems to reverberate through courtiers' posture, expressions, and even breathing. You probably won't survive this subtle influence if you tried to enact it yourself. Your timing, observation, and social intuition would collapse instantly. Historians still argue whether the jester's role was fundamentally performative or whether he functioned as a deliberate manipulator of social dynamics. You see him approach a circle of advisors, bowing with exaggerated humility before delivering a story about a foolish merchant who mistook wisdom for wealth. The nobles chuckle, nod, and occasionally shift in discomfort at the truths veiled in the narrative. Fringe accounts suggest that jesters were keenly aware of hidden tensions, inserting humor in ways that diffused potential conflicts or subtly influenced decisions. You probably wouldn't survive delivering such commentary without risking offense or misinterpretation. Yet the jester navigates it effortlessly. He leans closer to the queen, whispering an aside that transforms the story into a private joke. You probably won't survive noticing the layers here. Intimacy, trust, and selective communication all operate under the guise of folly. Fringe tales describe jesters as intermediaries who relayed observations, advice, or warnings that formal courtiers dared not voice. Historians still argue whether these interventions carried genuine weight in policymaking or were merely subtle amusement. For the monarch's enjoyment, you watch as he swings a small, stuffed animal toward a boastful noble, catching it with flair and exaggerating his motions. Laughter erupts, yet beneath it lies a complex social play. The noble's reaction, the king's amusement, and the ripple of observation among the audience. Fringe accounts claim that these seemingly trivial acts were carefully calibrated to measure loyalty, courage, and awareness. You probably wouldn't survive understanding or replicating this delicate dance of perception, humor, and influence. Historians still argue whether these performances were a conscious tool of social engineering or spontaneous entertainment. The jester now weaves between tables, delivering riddles that carry subtle critiques of recent policy or courtly behavior. You notice how each word is weighted, each pause timed to allow laughter to bloom before a punchline exposes hidden insight. Fringe historians note that jesters often memorized intricate details about individuals to craft personalized commentary. You probably wouldn't survive such mental juggling while simultaneously entertaining a room of nobles. Historians still argue whether the riddles, embedded critiques were ever consciously absorbed or merely appreciated for their wit. You notice how his body language punctuates every joke. A tilt of the head, a playful stumble, a carefully exaggerated bow communicate beyond the spoken word. Fringe accounts suggest that gestures reinforce the jester's verbal points, creating a layered performance that functioned both as amusement and subtle instruction. You probably wouldn't survive performing or interpreting these cues without intense focus and acute social perception. Historians still debate whether these nonverbal signals were universally understood or accessible only to an attuned subset of the court. You watch him manipulate attention deliberately, drawing focus to one noble, then pivoting to another, guiding the room's energy like a maestro conducting a symphony of perception. Fringe tales claim that such manipulation helped prevent conflicts from escalating, turning tension into shared amusement. You probably wouldn't survive managing the room's attention while juggling humor, insight, and social subtlety. Historians still argue whether this control over perception was recognized as a formal skill or remained an informal, ad hoc capability of exceptional jesters. A particularly boastful duke stands to interject. But the jester deftly redirects attention with a cleverly timed quip, a twirl, and a jingle of his bells. You probably won't survive responding so fluidly to multiple social inputs. Your timing would falter, your joke misfire, and the room's balance collapse. Fringe accounts suggest that these interventions were designed not only for amusement, but to preserve social harmony, subtly reminding nobles of limits without confrontation. Historians still argue whether such techniques were widespread practice or confined to individual genius. You notice the interplay of objects, a small mirror, a feather, a squeaky bladder-stick, each deployed with surgical precision to punctuate jokes or highlight folly. Fringe historians report that props often carried symbolic weight-mocking vanity, highlighting greed or subtly reflecting hidden truths about individuals. You probably wouldn't survive interpreting these layered signals in real time, let alone delivering them effectively. Historians still debate whether this symbolism was understood by audiences or only reconstructed by chroniclers later. The jester's improvisational skills become evident as he shifts from one story to another seamlessly, adjusting his performance to the mood attention, and reactions of the courtiers. You probably wouldn't survive navigating such rapid adaptation without error. The level of skill required is extraordinary. Fringe accounts suggest that adept jesters could turn potential offense into laughter, subtly diffusing tension while reinforcing social cohesion. Historians still argue whether such improvisation was rare genius or a common expectation for professional fools. You notice his voice modulation, exaggerated tones for comedic effect, softer whispers for subtle critique, rhythmic variations that guide laughter and attention. Fringe tales claim that this vocal control allowed jesters to emphasize points while masking intent, creating a dual narrative surface, amusement and hidden insight. You probably wouldn't survive mastering such vocal nuance without years of practice and innate musicality. Historians still debate whether the subtle manipulation of tone was intentional or naturally evolved as a byproduct of performance. Finally, you step back and observe the full tableau: laughter, relief, subtle social calibration, and tension dissipated, all orchestrated by the jester's careful combination of words, gestures, props, and improvisation. You probably wouldn't survive trying to recreate this orchestration. Too many variables, too many reactions, too many risks. Fringe accounts suggest that such performances were critical for maintaining both amusement and equilibrium within the volatile environment of the medieval court. Historians still argue whether the jester's influence extended to policy, alliances, or simply social mood, but the immediate impact is undeniable. You realize that jester's art is a form of social engineering, balancing entertainment with influence, folly with insight, and chaos with subtle control. Every word, gesture, and object is deployed with careful attention to timing, audience, and outcome. You probably wouldn't survive participating without extensive training, keen observation, and a fearless understanding of human nature. And as you watch him step back, surveying the court's reactions, you understand that this is more than comedy. It is a sophisticated negotiation of perception, emotion, and social structure, all conducted under the guise of harmless, colorful absurdity. You feel yourself leaning closer now, drawn into the subtle dance of influence the jester conducts with such effortless precision. You probably won't survive this level of social navigation untrained. Your nerves would fray, your timing falter, and your observations miss their mark. Historians still argue whether the jester's role in shaping court opinion was formalized or incidental. But the evidence of influence is woven throughout the anecdotes and records you watch unfold. You notice how he approaches a tense group of nobles, their whispered conversations halted by the sudden shift in the hall's energy. Fringe accounts suggest that jesters sometimes inserted humor deliberately to interrupt potential conflict, using laughter as a shield and a diversion. You probably wouldn't survive trying to anticipate social tension and redirect it without eliciting offense. But the jester performs it like a master weaver, threading subtle influence through the fabric of the court. He begins a tale about a stubborn king and a clever fox, exaggerating each movement and tone for maximum comedic impact. Yet beneath the humor, you sense commentary about stubbornness, strategic thinking, and the consequences of ignoring counsel. Fringe historians suggest that allegorical stories like these allowed jesters to critique rulers indirectly, delivering insights without threatening their authority. You probably wouldn't survive delivering or decoding such layered narratives. It's a skill demanding both intelligence and social courage. Historians still argue whether these allegories were absorbed by rulers as guidance or merely appreciated for amusement. You watch him execute a series of acrobatic gestures, punctuated by subtle glances, nods, and pauses that reinforce the message of his story. Fringe accounts report that these physical elements often carried symbolic meaning. A bow might reflect deference, a stumble, a warning, a gesture, a coded critique. You probably wouldn't survive performing with such dual purpose where every movement carries both humor and hidden meaning. Historians still debate whether the physicality of jesters' acts was central to their influence or primarily a tool of entertainment. The jester now engages a group of young pages, using playful instruction and exaggerated mimicry to teach lessons in hierarchy, observation, and patience. Fringe stories suggest that jesters functioned as informal mentors, embedding moral and social guidance in seemingly frivolous activities. You probably wouldn't survive balancing humor with instruction without undermining either objective. Historians still argue whether these educational interactions were intentional strategy or incidental benefits of performance. You notice subtle micro-expressions on the courtiers' faces: suppressed laughter, quick glances, small shifts in posture, almost imperceptible acknowledgments of critique. Fringe accounts claim that jesters observed these cues meticulously, adapting jokes, timing, and gestures to optimize both amusement and social influence. You probably wouldn't survive this acute observational multitasking, where one missed glance could compromise an entire act. Historians still debate whether such attention to micro-expressions was conscious skill or instinctive talent developed through experience. He pauses, catching a noble's frown with a playful jingle of bells, then redirects the room's attention with a witty aside. You probably won't survive this type of improvisation, where reading, mood, timing, humor, and calibrating risk happen simultaneously. Fringe tales suggest that such quick, fluid adjustments allow jesters to maintain authority, prevent offense, and subtly guide courtly dynamics. Historians still argue whether these interventions were routine strategy or exceptional acts of genius. The jester's storytelling now weaves between absurdity and reflection, moving seamlessly from an exaggerated tale of a greedy merchant to an allegorical critique of arrogance among the king's advisors. Fringe accounts suggest that layered narratives like this created opportunities for reflection disguised as entertainment. You probably wouldn't survive deciphering these dual narratives in real time. The skill lies in delivering critique that is simultaneously funny and thought-provoking. Historians still argue whether rulers consciously absorbed these lessons or simply enjoyed the show. You watch as he integrates a small mirror and a feathered fan into his act. The mirror reflects a noble's expression comically. The fan exaggerates gestures. Fringe historians note that these props served multiple functions. They amplified humor, punctuated critique, and subtly highlighted human foibles. You probably wouldn't survive interpreting or deploying these visual cues effectively. Historians still argue whether props carried intentionally coded messages or whether their symbolic significance was applied retrospectively by chroniclers. The jester now performs a complex sequence of juggling, physical comedy, and storytelling, timed to coincide with courtly attention and reaction. You probably won't survive orchestrating such a multi-dimensional performance without losing focus. Fringe accounts claim that exceptional jesters use these layered performances to maintain equilibrium, manage attention, and even subtly influence alliances or decisions. Historians still debate whether these acts were consciously political or primarily performative, though the sophistication suggests more than mere amusement. You notice the subtle interplay of humor and risk, a joke that could provoke discomfort, a gesture that might embarrass, a story that teeters on critique. Fringe tales suggest that jesters walked this line daily, calibrating comedy to test boundaries without crossing them. You probably wouldn't survive the constant tension of balancing delight, insight, and safety. Historians still argue whether this delicate risk management was a learned skill or innate talent, though it's clear that mastery ensured survival. He concludes this segment with a dramatic flourish, drawing attention to a minor folly among the courtiers, exaggerating it, then folding it back into a broader lesson on humility and awareness. You probably wouldn't survive performing such a seamless integration of humor and social instruction. Fringe accounts suggest that this ability to combine critique, observation, and amusement was central to a jester's power. Historians still argue whether the impact of such performances endured or remained momentary, but the immediate effect diffused tension, laughter, reflection is undeniable. Finally, you notice the subtle changes in the room. Nobles relaxed, Whispers of tension dissipated, and laughter softened into thoughtful smiles. You probably wouldn't survive managing these shifts without the Jesters' combination of insight, humor, and agility. Fringe accounts suggest that Jesters acted as both entertainers and mediators, their performances subtly shaping mood, behavior, and social equilibrium. Historians still argue whether these interventions shape decisions in lasting ways, but the immediate social orchestration is clear. You realize that the Jester's art extends beyond spectacle. He is a strategist, social engineer, and observer disguised in motley. You probably wouldn't survive replicating his mastery, balancing comedy, critique, improvisation, and diplomacy simultaneously. And as you watch him step back, surveying the hall, you understand that this is more than entertainment. It is a living, breathing orchestration of perception, influence, and subtle instruction, all conducted beneath the colorful veil of folly. You feel the final stretch of the evening settle around you. The hall now quieter, yet the Jester's energy still radiates in every corner. You probably won't survive stepping into his shoes without being overwhelmed by the sheer complexity of observation, improvisation, and social nuance required. Historians still argue whether the Jester's role was a formal position of influence or a spontaneous function of wit. But watching him, you sense that he straddles the line between entertainer, advisor, and social strategist. You notice the subtle shifts in posture among the nobles, a smirk lingering on one duke's lips, a slight slump in another's shoulders, whispers and chuckles bouncing quietly from one corner to another. Fringe accounts suggest that Jesters were keenly aware of these micro-reactions and adjusted performance accordingly, exploiting each subtle cue to maximize both amusement and influence. You probably wouldn't survive tracking such a web of tiny signals while maintaining physical and verbal dexterity. Historians still debate whether this attentiveness was conscious skill or instinctive artistry developed over years. The Jester now moves closer to the center of the hall, sweeping his gaze across the room. A small bell jingles in rhythm with his steps. You probably won't survive the multitasking, balancing audience attention. Comedic timing, improvisation, and subtle critique requires extraordinary coordination. Fringe historians suggest that this awareness of room dynamics allowed Jesters to act as mediators, diffusing tension, redirecting conversation, or highlighting folly in ways that were socially acceptable. Historians still argue whether this influence reached policy decisions or remained confined to social regulation. You watch him perform a brief mimicry of a pompous noble attempting to read a letter, exaggerating every gesture and expression. Laughter erupts, yet beneath the comedy is a lesson about humility, focus, and observation. Fringe accounts suggest that such mimicry was carefully calibrated to expose human foibles without provoking outright conflict. You probably wouldn't survive pulling off such nuanced critique without causing offense. Historians still debate whether these lessons were internalized or simply laughed off. But the Jester's ability to convey critique through humor is evident. You notice the Jester's deft use of props, a small mirror reflecting a noble's exaggerated face, a stuffed animal bouncing in rhythm with his tail, a feathered fan punctuating gestures. Fringe sources report that these props were more than comedic tools. They were instruments of social commentary, subtle mirrors of behavior, and hierarchy. You probably wouldn't survive juggling symbolism, humor, and observation simultaneously. Historians still argue whether the symbolic weight of props was consciously recognized or retrospectively assigned by chroniclers. He weaves a story involving a minor disagreement over land, translating it into a sequence of exaggerated characters and slapstick actions. You probably won't survive appreciating the layers: entertainment, critique, subtle moral guidance, and social observation, all interlaced seamlessly. Fringe tales suggest that Jesters often memorize details about personalities, tendencies, and recent disputes to tailor performances with precision. Historians still debate whether this functioned as informal counseling or simply heightened amusement for the court. You observe micro-intentions, A subtle glance exchanged between the jester and the queen. A wink at a page, a gentle nudge to a nervous courtier. Fringe historians claim these gestures served multiple purposes: communication, assessment, and reinforcement of social hierarchy, all hidden under the guise of performance. You probably wouldn't survive decoding these signals without intimate familiarity with both the audience and the jester's style. Historians still argue whether these nuanced interactions had long-term social or political effects. The jester now directs attention to the far side of the hall, orchestrating a complex sequence of juggling, acrobatics, and storytelling. Each movement is precise, each glance deliberate, each prop strategically deployed. You probably won't survive attempting such a layered performance. Coordination, perception, and timing must converge flawlessly. Fringe accounts suggest that this choreography could influence mood, highlight folly, or even subtly nudge alliances. Historians still argue whether such acts were part of a conscious strategy or evolved organically through experience. You notice how the jester alternates between overt comedy and near-silent cues, allowing laughter to bloom, then cutting it with a raised eyebrow or slight pause. Fringe accounts suggest these techniques tested perception, patience, and attentiveness, guiding the court's emotional and cognitive engagement. You probably wouldn't survive this delicate balancing act. The ability to blend humor, observation, and social influence is rare. Historians still debate whether these subtle manipulations were intended for education, amusement, or practical governance. Finally, you watch him settle into a quiet bow, bells jingling softly, animals retreating to their corners, props collected, and the hall exhaling a collective sigh of relief. Laughter lingers, tension fades, and social equilibrium has subtly been restored. Fringe historians suggest that the jester's final gesture consolidates influence, mood, and attention, leaving an imprint on the court's behavior that may last beyond the immediate performance. You probably wouldn't survive replicating this orchestration. It requires mastery of humor, timing, improvisation, psychology, and diplomacy. Historians still argue whether these subtle interventions had lasting consequences or were ephemeral, but the immediate impact is undeniable. As the hall settles into calm, you reflect on the layers of performance: juggling, acrobatics, props, riddles, storytelling, mimicry, subtle gestures, and keen observation. You probably wouldn't survive integrating these elements into a coherent act that is simultaneously amusing, insightful, and socially instructive. Fringe accounts claim that the jester's art was a form of sophisticated social engineering, blending perception, influence, and entertainment. Historians still debate whether these skills were exceptional or widespread, but the mastery you've witnessed is extraordinary. And as you exhale, the hall quiets around you. You understand the truth. The medieval court jester was no mere fool. He was a master orchestrator of attention, a subtle manipulator of mood, a conduit of critique, and a guardian of equilibrium. You probably won't survive attempting to replicate this delicate blend of folly and insight. But you've seen it, you've felt it, and the echoes of his art linger, reminding you that wisdom sometimes arrives disguised in the most colorful and absurd forms. The hall has quieted now, and you find yourself breathing a little slower, your senses attuned to the lingering warmth of laughter and the faint jingling echoing in your memory. You probably won't survive fully capturing the jester's mastery in your own hands. Yet you can feel the essence: humor as a bridge, folly as a mirror, and subtle observation as a guide through human folly and virtue alike. Fringe tales linger in your mind: the monkeys, the squeaky props, the mirrors reflecting exaggerated face, Saul dancing in a choreography that seems chaotic yet precise. The flickering torchlight casts soft shadows across the stone walls. And you notice details you might have missed before: a quiet nod from a noble still smiling, the gentle sway of a curtain disturbed by some unseen motion, the faint scent of spiced wine lingering in the corners. Each small sensation reminds you of how alive the court was. how each performance threaded through layers of perception, emotion, and subtle instruction. You probably won't survive the intricate social ballet without guidance. Yet now, you understand its rhythm, its push and pull, and its quiet magic. As your mind drifts, the chaos of juggling, riddles, mimicry, and whispered commentary softens into a gentle cadence. The animals scurry away, the props are collected, and the hall exhales with a sense of relief and equilibrium restored. You probably won't survive the depth of observation and improvisation the jester maintained. But you can savor the effect. Laughter leaving echoes, tension dissipated, insights delivered under the guise of play. Now dim the lights, feel the room quiet around you, and imagine the jester's voice fading into the shadows, leaving a trace of wisdom wrapped in humor. You probably won't survive seeing all the world's follies and truths through his eyes. But you can carry a fragment. That laughter can illuminate. That absurdity can instruct, and that even in chaos, skillful artistry maintains balance. And with that, you let yourself drift, carried gently on the final ripple of bells, giggles, and whispered truths.